So, we are talking about, and we're going to be re-looking, right, at a topic that we talked about 5 years ago, about prisons, about institutions that are meant to rehabilitate people. We're talking about these places that many people in society don't know about, but they know they exist, but they don't know what goes on in them. Because it's behind closed doors, it's behind walls. There's overcrowding, there's sentencing inflation, there's emergency measures that have had to be put in place for releases. This is not about individual cases. This is talking about the prison system as a whole in the UK.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode. We really appreciate you joining us. This podcast really shows us how we can all learn, live, and thrive off of each other. By sharing our knowledge through our conversations, we will impart some knowledge whilst learning ourselves how to progress even further. Here is your host.
Hello and welcome to Around the World Today, Series 9, Episode numero uno, for those who don't speak Spanish, number 1. This is Episode 1. In this new series, we turn our attention to a part of the British state that most people rarely see and rarely think about, unless something goes wrong. It's a world behind walls, controlled gates and iron bars. Yet it touches thousands of lives every day. Families, communities, and even public policy are all affected by what happens inside. We are talking, of course, about the prison system here in England and Wales, a system that carries the weight of punishment and public protection, and, in theory, rehabilitation, a system designed to keep society safe, but increasingly under pressure, struggling to balance law, logistics, and humanity. We begin with the fundamentals. Overcrowding, the numbers are rising. With them, tensions too. Sentencing inflation, policies designed to be tough on crime, have consequences for capacity, safety, and the future of those inside. Emergency measures, stopgaps, temporary fixes, and political interventions that try to hold a system together that's totally under stress. This is not about individual cases, or the headlines, or about scandal. It's about the structure, the framework that holds the system together, and increasingly, the cracks that threaten it. We will look at why prisons are full, who decides how long people stay inside, and what it means for society when the balance between justice, safety, and humanity is stretched to its limits. Tonight we start at a very foundation of the system, how it works, why it struggles, and what the struggle tells us about modern Britain. The prison estate in England and Wales is managed by His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, operating under the authority of the Ministry of Justice. Together, they oversee more than 100 establishments, a mixture of Victorian-era prisons, modern prisons, and training prisons, high-security facilities, women's prisons, privately operated sites, and some of these prisons were built over a century ago, long before modern standards of human rights and rehabilitation were considered essential. Others are recent, purpose-built facilities intended to offer education and training opportunities to reduce reoffending. At any time, tens of thousands of people are held in custody. But the number that matters most is not the headline population figure you read in newspapers. It is the operational capacity, the number of prisoners that can be held safely while maintaining security, staff oversight, and access to education and rehabilitation programs. Every prison has a certified normal accommodation level. This is what it is designed to hold safely. Operational capacity allows some flexibility. Doesn't that sound a bit like an airline or a shop now? It gives you some flexibility to do this, including temporary measures such as doubling up in cells built for one person or using converted spaces, not originally intended as living quarters, but these measures are sometimes stopgaps and not solutions. To me, it's starting to sound like, when you've got a bowl of water, it's like you've got to do your dishes, right, people? And you're filling your sink now. You've got the bowl in there and you're filling your sink. And some mornings when I make my bacon and mushroom sandwich, because that's what I'm going for right now for my breakfast, and if my doctor is listening to this, I do apologise, doctor. But my bacon and mushrooms toasted sandwich in the morning, and I sometimes, I cook the bacon and I cook the mushrooms on the frying pan, and then I like to wash the frying pan because, But so I leave the tap run when I'm cooking. And I sometimes don't get back to the tap because I'm turning the bacon and the mushrooms over. And the bowl with the water coming through is just overfilling. And it's just going down the sink now. Do you know what I mean? That's what this system is starting to seem like to me from reading. When a system is constantly operates above its intended capacity, it loses resilience. And resilience in a prison management is critical. It means that having the ability to separate vulnerable prisoners from those who might harm them, isolate individuals who pose security risks, absorb sudden increases in remand prisoners when court backlogs rise, run education, work and rehabilitation programs without cancellation. When occupancy pushes towards the maximum limits, flexibility disappears. A single violent incident can trigger a wing-wide lockdown. Staff shortages due to sickness or stress can force restricted regimes. Education, classrooms and workshops sit empty because there ain't enough officers to escort prisoners safely. Overcrowding is not just about numbers. It changes the culture of an institution. In overcrowded conditions, time out of cell is reduced, leaving prisoners locked up for longer hours without meaningful activity. Frustration among prisoners rises, often spilling over into violence or bullying. Mental health deteriorates with increased self-harm and suicide attempts reported across the estate. Tensions escalate between staff and prisoners between prisoners themselves, creating a volatile environment that can escalate rapidly. Recent inspection reports by His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons recently noted rising levels of violence, self-harm, and assaults in overcrowding prisons. Some describe incidents where prisoners have been forced to sleep on mattresses on the floor because cells were full, or where vulnerable prisoners were left unmonitored due to staff shortages. It is also worth noting the hidden pressures of staff morale and retention. Overcrowded prisons are more stressful places to work. Officers face higher risks of assault, more complex management challenges, and increased burnout. Turnover rises, creating further strain on the system and leaving prisons short-staffed. A feedback loop that worsens overcrowding conditions. Running over 100% occupancy may appear efficient on paper. It may even look cost-effective in the short term, but in reality, overcrowding creates fatigue. It reduces the ability of the system to respond to crisis, compromises rehabilitation, and risks violating basic human rights obligations. In short, overcrowding is not a simple operational problem. It is a structural one, reflecting the interselection of sentencing policy, funding constraints, and political priorities. Later in this series, we will see how this pressure interacts with sentencing decisions, emergency measures, and the human stories behind the statistics. But for now, it is enough to understand that overcrowding is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a crisis that shapes every aspect of life inside British prisons.
Click, listen, enjoy.
If crime has not dramatically increased in recent years, why then has the prison population remained persistently high? The answer is not simply about offending. It's about how the law responds to crime, and how, more specifically, about sentencing policy. Over the past 2 decades, average custodial sentence lengths have increased significantly. This is true for serious violent offences, sexual offences, and even certain non-violent crimes. Mandatory minimum sentences have been introduced and extended, recall to custody for breaches of licence conditions have grown sharply. Extended determinate sentences, those that keep prisoners in for a longer proportion of their term under strict supervision, have also become more common. Each of these changes may be justified in isolation. Politicians often argue that longer sentences serve the public protection, deter offending, and signal seriousness to victims. But when these policies accumulate, they create a catalyst that you know, it's that analogy that I've given previous. You've got a tap, you've got a bowl, you've got water going into it. It's just overflowing. Do you know what I mean? There is no supply and demand there. Because there's no demand, there's no supply there. There's demand for it, you know, because there is. Okay. Once sentence lengths increase, they really rarely decrease. And longer sentences mean more people remain in custody at any given time. Even if admissions to prison remain steady, the release rate shows leading to population growth within the estate. Consider this in concrete terms. If a prisoner who might once have served 3 years now serves 6 years, that single individual occupies a cell for twice as long. Multiply that by thousands of cases across the country, and the effect is dramatic. The cumulative result is a prison population steadily rises, even if crime levels remain flat or on decline. The political incentives for this are clear. Government, across the political spectrum, Conservatives and Labour alike, have been reluctant to reduce sentence lengths. High-profile crimes dominate the media coverage, creating public pressure to do something and signalling toughness on crime. Opposition parties rarely campaign to shorten sentences. Together, sentencing becomes both politically popular and electorally expedient. The structural consequences, however, are less considered. Parliament passes tougher sentencing laws, courts apply them, and the prisoner state absorbs the impact. This is where tension emerges. Sentencing policy can change quickly, sometimes overnight, in response to a single high-profile incident. But the prison system cannot expand overnight. Building a new prison takes years. Recruiting and training staff takes even longer. Existing prisons cannot suddenly accommodate hundreds of additional prisoners safely. The result is overcrowding, operational stress, and increasing fatigue on the institutions. Sentencing inflation also has other less obvious consequences. Longer sentences reduce the capacity for rehabilitation. When prisoners spend more time in overcrowded conditions, their engagement with education, work, and therapeutic programs diminishes. The prison system becomes less effective at reducing reoffending. The very goal that longer sentences are sometimes claimed to save. And then there is the human cost. Families see their loved ones incarcerated for longer. Communities feel the effects of removing individuals for extended periods. The system is not meant to protect society, paradoxically strains society. One of the clearest examples of sentencing inflation is the increase in recall for license breaches. People released on license who fail to comply with curfew or reporting requirements are returned to prison often for relatively minor infractions, while the intention is public protection. The result is that thousands more people held in custody for for technicalities rather than violence or serious criminal behaviour, further pressuring the estate. Similarly, extended determinate sentences for serious violence and sexual offenders keep individuals in custody for longer periods, which can reduce reoffending in some cases, but also significantly contributes to the population growth. In essence, sentencing inflation is a structural driver of overcrowding. It amplifies pressure in a system already struggling to operate within capacity, and it highlights the fundamental imbalance policy decisions made in Parliament and courtrooms ripple directly into daily lives of staff and prisoners, shaping the culture and the safety and the fundamentality of the prison estate. Later in this series, we will explore how these sentencing choices intersect with emergency measures, remand populations and human consequences, showing not just numbers on a page, but the real impact on those living and working behind the walls and the gates. For now, it's enough to understand that longer sentences, more recalls, expand mandatory minimums are not the natural, they're the accumulative. They compound and they are intensify the very overcrowding crisis we examined in our first segment. When the prison population approaches or exceeds the operational capacity, the Ministry of Justice is forced to intervene. These interventions are often described as emergency measures, short-term fixes designed to relieve pressure in a system that cannot expand quickly enough to match the rising demand. Over the last decade, emergency measures have taken several forms. Sometimes are administratively, some are operational, and some are legislative. One of the most familiar measures is temporary early release schemes. Certain prisoners, often those approaching the end of their sentence, may be released slightly ahead of schedule to free up space. These releases are carefully managed, but they are not a long-term solution. It seems to me that a lot of these things don't have long-term solutions. They merely delay the inevitable. Accumulative of prisoners if admissions remain high and sentences remain long. Another key tool is home detention curfew, HDC. Eligible prisoners can serve the final portion of their sentence under strict electronic monitoring at home, rather than in a prison cell. Adjustments to HDC eligibility, for example, allowing more prisoners to qualify for or reducing the minimum time served before the release can only temporarily ease capacity. One of these was last year when they changed this. Physical solutions have also been deployed. Rapid build or modular units have been added within some prison grounds. These are effectively emergency wings, designed to house more prisoners quickly. While useful, they are expensive and require trained staff to operate safely. Unlike the administrative measures, they do not solve the underlying structural pressures that caused the overcrowding in the first place. No shit. There is also relocation of prisoners across the whole state. Where one prison is full, others with space, capacity, may take additional prisoners. While this may sound simple, it has consequences. Prisoners may be transferred far from their families, their support networks, and rehabilitative programs. Staff may have to manage unfamiliar populations, increasing the risk of incidents. Emergency legislation has occasionally been introduced to provide the Ministry of Justice with temporary powers to manage numbers more flexibly. These laws are designed to give the system room to breathe, but they are reactive rather than proactive. It is important to understand that these emergency measures are pressure valves, not structural solutions. They buy time, sometimes months, sometimes years, but they do not change the root cause of overcrowding. Sentencing policy, insufficient investment in infrastructure, or systematic inefficiencies there are also legal limits to what can be done. The European Court of Human Rights has repeatedly ruled that extreme overcrowding may breach Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The prohibition against humane and or degrading treatment. This means that prisoners cannot simply keep coming or cramming people in. Conditions matter, space matters, time out of cell matters. When these emergency measures are applied, the consequences ripple throughout the system. Overcrowding may be temporary, reduced, but staff workloads remain high. Rehabilitation programs are disrupted, and the violence and self-harm can still spike. Officers face continued stress, turnover remains high, and fatigue. Operational systems continue to wobble under pressure like jelly. Even the most well-designed temporary measures can only delay a crisis, not prevent it. Without a longer-term plan, wherever that's expanding the estate, changing sentencing policies, or investing in alternative forms of rehabilitation, emergency measures are a bandage over a structural wound. In the next segment, we will look at the operational burden, how HM Prison and Probation Service manages these pressures on a day-to-day basis, and what it takes to keep the prison system functioning when the walls are literally closing in. If emergency measures are the pressure valves, the HM Prison and Probation Service is the engine, keeping the system running. day in, day out, behind locked doors. Its responsibilities are vast, complex, and often underappreciated. HM Prison and Probation Service is tasked with maintaining safety and security across more than 100 establishments, preventing escapes and managing high-risk prisoners, reducing violence and self-harm, both among prisoners and against staff, providing education, work, and rehabilitation programs designed to reduce reoffending, delivering healthcare, including mental health support, in a system often understaffed and over capacity, managing probation services, supervising offenders in the community, and ensuring compliance with licence conditions. All of this is done within the constraints of budget and allocation set by the Ministry of Justice and within the sentencing frameworks established by Parliament. Here lies the paradox. The operational arm of the prison system is expected to absorb the consequences of decisions it's not made and does not have the power to make. Sentencing lengths, mandatory minimums, recall rules, these are often set by politicians and judges. The prison service does not decide how many people will enter, how long they will stay, or the types of offence they have committed. Yet, it is His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service that must make the numbers work. When overcrowding peaks, the agency adapts. Staff are redeployed to critical areas. Education and work programs are suspended or reduced. Prisoners may be doubled up in cells meant for one person. Extra security measures are introduced to prevent violence or escape. These adaptations have limitations when they are stretched too far. Safety is compromised, staff morale drops, turnover increases, recruitment becomes harder. The system frequently becomes visible to everyone, inside and outside the walls. The operational burden also has a human dimension. Prison officers and probation staff face daily challenges, balancing safety, rehabilitation, and the legal rights of prisoners. Their decisions can have life-changing consequences for individuals and communities, yet they operate under immense pressure and scrutiny. Mistakes, even minor ones, can have repercussions. Staff are often the first to experience the consequences of overcrowding and sentencing inflation. More prisoners per officer means less time to observe behaviour, intervene early, and deliver programs that reduce reoffending. It also increases exposure to assaults, verbal abuse, and stressful incidents, which can exacerbate a burnout. The operational burden does not stop at the prison gates. Probation officers in the community are affected. Overcrowding and delay releases mean more prisoners on licence, more recalls for technical breaches, and greater workloads for staff supervising individuals in high-risk solutions. In short, the HM Prison and Probation Service is the fulcrum of the system. It balances public safety, prisoner welfare, and operational necessities, all while carrying the weight of political decisions and structural constraints. Understanding this operational reality is critical. Without appreciating the burden carried out by the agencies, it is easy to oversimplify the crisis as prisons being full or staff not doing their job. The truth is far from complex. The operational arm of the system functions as the shock absorber of the system under immense and sustained pressure. See, we've already talked about this in this podcast, and I gave you an analogy of when I was making my bacon and mushroom toasted sandwich in the morning, and I'm running the tap and I'm cooking, but I don't see that the tap is overflowing. I've given you that analogy of what happens when you haven't got capacity in your bowl anymore for any more water. It spills over and then goes down the sink. Next, we turn to the final segment of this episode. Strategic choice. What these pressures reveal about the purpose of prisons in England and Wales, and the decisions society make if it hopes to resolve this crisis. As we've explored on this episode, the prison system in England and Wales is under enormous pressure. Overcrowding, sentencing, inflation, and emergency measures have created a fatigue, reactive system, but these operational stresses raise a deeper fundamental question. What are prisons for? Is the primary purpose punishment, deterrence, public protection, or rehabilitation? The answer is really simple. Historically, prisons have adapted to serve all of these goals, but tensions between them are inevitable. Overcrowding and extended sentences make rehabilitation difficult. Emergency measures and reactive management can prioritise containment over correction. Political pressure can push punishment and deterrence to the forefront, while the needs of the prisoners and staff are sidelined. If the purpose of prisons is primarily punitive, then overcrowding is inevitable. Consequence, longer sentences, stricter recall policies, and expanded mandatory minimums are deemed more space, and the only way to accommodate that is to build more prisons. A costly, politically fought and long-term solution. If prisons are meant to protect the public, then risk assessment and targeted custody becomes central in theory. This approach allows low-risk offenders to be managed in the community, reducing pressure on the physical space. But risk-based approaches require investment in probation, electronic monitoring, and community rehabilitation programs, areas often underfunded. If the goal is rehabilitation, reducing reoffending, and reintegrating individuals into society, then overcrowding is deeply counterproductive to this. When prisons have limited access to education, work, and support services, rehabilitation cannot occur effectively. Longer sentences do not compensate for poor conditions. They can make the problem worse. So, in England and Wales, face a strategic choice. Option 1. Continue expanding the estate, build more prisons, add more cells, recruit more staff. This is expensive, politically visible, and reactive. It maintains a punitive, focused approach. Option 2. Reconsider sentencing philosophy. Shorter sentences for non-violent offenders, reduce recalls for minor licence breaches, and investment in the community supervision could relieve overcrowding while protecting the public safely and rehabilitation. This is politically sensitive and requires a willingness to challenge deeply entrenched ideas about tough on crime policies. Avoiding the choice is no longer sustainable. The current approach, reactive emergency measures, doubled up cells, overworked staff, and stretched budgets, is a stopgap. It cannot and will not solve the underlying problems. Ultimately, the system we build reflects the society we want to be. Do we value punishment above all? Or do we value rehabilitation and reintegration and public safety balanced with human dignity? The strategic choice is one, and it's ours, and the consequences are visible in every prison corridor, every overcrowded cell, and every overworked officer. Over the coming weeks, the series will explore these tensions in detail. We'll look at who goes to prison, the growth of remand populations, the legacy of indeterminate sentences, officer misconduct, and how women and youth are treated in custody. This episode, we have laid the foundations of understanding the pressures on prisons are structural, not incidental. The operational crisis is a result of policy decisions, and that the fundamental purpose of imprisonment is a question that remains unresolved. The system is at a crossroads, and how we answer the question of the purpose will determine whether it can survive the pressures of the next decade. Thank you for tuning in to Around the World Today. Series 9, Episode 1. I'm Terry Davies. And join us next time for Episode 2, Who Goes to Prison in Modern Britain? This will be released next Saturday.
Loved what you've heard on this week's episode? Well, the answer is simple. It would mean the world to us if you could head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star review.